All right, today I have Dr. Susan Kleiner. Did I pronounce that right, Kleiner?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good, because I hate when I butcher names. But I'm really excited to have you on because, like we were talking about before the podcast, I bought your first edition of Power Eating, but when I was in college, I started that program when I was 18, which was 10 years ago. So it was one of the first nutrition. It was actually the first nutrition book I actually bought and really like dug into and read. Maybe I was 19. It was 9 or 10 years ago. And then I know you recently came out with a new one, which we're going to talk about as well. But you actually came and spoke at the school, which I got to see too. So it was really cool that we got reconnected and I was able to have you on the podcast. So I'm excited about this. So first and foremost, introduce yourself in a nutshell, kind of who you are and why you got into this in the first place.
Oh, well, thanks. It's so great to be here. First of all, I think you probably had your first edition of Power Eating was probably the third edition. The first edition was published in 1997.
Got it.
And we call it the Superman edition. That one was a white background with big blue and red letters. Now we are into, and what you heard was the new Power Eating. It is essentially the fifth edition of Power Eating. So a little bit of a legacy, something I'm very proud of. And speaking of when and how I started, so I was a pre-Title IX girl in Cleveland, Ohio, and there were no sports, and except if you wanted to do field hockey. That was the only varsity sport available. In fact, we had a gorgeous brand new Olympic-sized swimming pool in my high school, and on the door it said boys pool. So the girls could not swim in that pool. We had no opportunity to be in that pool. We could do swim timing for the boys swim team, of which I did, but we couldn't swim. So my sport was dance. I was a modern dancer. I trained in New York City at 15, 16 years old, but then decided that the life I would have to lead there in those days didn't really align with sort of the, I think the ecosystem of my family, which is the way we think of ourselves. And so I came home and knew I had a curious mind and went to college. I went to a very small liberal arts college that was very research focused called Hiram College in Cleveland, outside Cleveland. And it was kind of funny. If you wanted to go to med school, it was considered that you were kind of a failure at research. So I was interested in health and I thought I wanted to go to medical school, and went to an interview at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine with the late Dr. Horrigan, Dan Horrigan, who was the dad of a good friend of mine in high school. And he said, Susan, we'd love to have you in med school. Now this is 1979. Okay. We'd love to have you in med school. You won't learn anything that you're interested in. You're interested in health. We teach people how to treat disease. Go talk to the Department of Nutrition. And I thought, oh my God, I thought nutrition was just a hobby. And so off I went to the very first program in the nation in public health nutrition at Case Western Reserve University. So they already had a history of 100 years. And but I said, I want to study nutrition and exercise. And they said, there is no such thing. And I said, well, actually, I know that they're studying it in California and in New York, but I need to live at home to be a grad student, to afford to go grad school. And they said, well, you know, we're going to let you loose. You study the basics of nutrition and you teach us what you learn about nutrition and human performance. And so I got my master's, became a registered dietitian, worked the least amount of time necessary to be in a hospital to get registered, immediately came back for my PhD, and in between that time had started training with a female bodybuilder. And I was fascinated with what anyone could do. And those were the bad old days of old gyms that had, you know, maybe a few machines, but it was all free weights, all big dudes, everyone juiced up, even my teacher. And it was quite a subculture, a very silent subculture in those days. Arnold was just, you know, he was kind of just the be all and end all at that time. And I was just fascinated with the capacity of the human body to build muscle. And there was nothing in research on how you build muscle and strength. And so that became my research. And I did the very first study on the nutritional practices of competitive male bodybuilders, both taking steroids and steroid free. We had 35 subjects, and today it is the seminal research on examining the health, the cardiovascular risks, the association with steroids, as well as diet, and the impact on body composition, as well as cardiovascular disease risk. And I just was fascinated with the whole thing. Now, I never went on to compete, but I worked with world champions, the research at that time, and then continued on. I got Mr. Mannion let me come to the NPC National Physique Committee Mr. and Miss USA competition and collect data in Raleigh, North Carolina, while I was on faculty at Duke and at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So that was the heart and soul of my beginning. I was the only person really studying nutrition with a nutrition methodology background and looking at strength training and bodybuilding. And so strength and power sports became my bailiwick. And in those days, we had about a dozen sort of card-carrying, what became sports nutritionists. My degree was nutrition and human performance because the term sports nutrition didn't exist yet. And so, so we, at least when I began, not by the time I graduated with my doctorate. And so we would swap clients, you know, when Ellen Coleman got a bodybuilder and I had a triathlete or an Ironman competitor, early days of Ironman, she'd have her client call me, I'd have my client call her. She was in Orange County. You know, when I had marathon runners, I was calling Nancy Clark. When I was, you know, so we all knew each other, and it was an amazing collegial sort of pioneering group. Now we're all kind of the godmothers, I think, of sports nutrition, and it is wonderful to see. Especially, you know, so many years went by. I have been an academic. I have been a scientific researcher. I have consulted with business and industry. I have been a business owner of two startups myself. Neither of them went anywhere, but it was a very interesting experience. I'm an author and a speaker. And as much as I can communicate and translate the science of food and supplements into enhancing sport performance and helping people push out the walls of athletic challenge, that's what I love to do.
I love it. I mean, shit, I have to thank you because I think you really did pioneer a lot of what I do today, you know, as somebody who coaches using science-based principles for really nutrition, right? Like that's
exactly. Yeah. One of the fun things I got to do that I think has really left its mark with 4 of my colleagues about, I think it's 17 years now, is, or maybe a little longer, was found the International Society of Sport Nutrition. And that came out of some frustration where the specialty practice group for sports and cardiovascular nutrition out of what was then the American Dietetic Association, you could only come to those meetings and be a member if you were a registered dietitian. Yet there was, at that time, it was the burgeoning of personal training, and clearly there would never be enough registered dietitians to go around and touch everyone, but personal trainers were growing and growing, and you were where the rubber meets the road as far as I was concerned. And so in order to raise the bar for personal trainers, for coaches, for industry to understand what is research and how do you make a better product, for academics to meet the manufacturers, for students and athletes to meet everybody, I wanted one place where everyone could do that, and that was the founding of the International Society of Sport Nutrition. So there are 5 of us who are co-founders, and it is definitely a place where coaches and trainers belong.
That's actually really cool. I didn't realize that because I've had Jose Antonio on the podcast, and I've actually stayed in touch with them ever since then. We've talked. I'm planning on doing my CISSN here soon as
Mm-hmm.
well. And the amount of times I've referred to JISSN, the journal, on this podcast is insane because there's so much free access to so many good research.
Right.
So that's really cool that you're one of the founders. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So it was actually, if you ask Jose, he'll tell you it was my idea, and it was a rant over dinner one night where everyone laughed at me, and then 3 months later he said, "Did you really mean that?" I said, "Yes, I mean that."
There's that saying, like the best ideas are written on bar napkins or whatever, and that's kind of that, right? Like when you're on these, and that's actually one of the things I love as kind of like a side tangent, going to seminars, going to things like those conferences, and going to dinner with the other people attending later on and having conversations with different trainers and nutritionists and people you've never met before is when I've had some of the most fun conversations, the most fun times, and some of the best ideas that I've ever had.
Yeah, it's a real coming together. I mean, it's at the time, as I said, it was dietitians who owned the territory over sports nutrition. Yet exercise physiologists knew an awful lot. Maybe they couldn't speak in terms of food, and that was really the purview of the dietitian at the time. But they certainly understood the physiology and the demands and the biochemistry. And so to me, partnering, teamwork is the ideal situation. The things they knew that we didn't know as well at that time. Today, people have, dual degrees or and I really encourage that, to get as educated as you can, because this is really a specialty. And so if you are a trainer who wants to know about nutrition, then seek training. Don't just think that you can listen to a couple of podcasts and go out and take care of people, because you really do impact their health and their life and their behavior. And many of these things, many of the negative things that happen are often associated with people who are wanting to help, but are saying this was what worked for me, so it must work for everybody. And that isn't the truth.
Yeah, I think I've actually said something similar many times. I think a lot of young trainers and nutritionists do that at the beginning. Like I remember for me, I mean, years ago when I tried intermittent fasting, and it worked great for me because I trained at night, I had school during the day, like it was perfect. And I was like, that's it. All my clients have to do intermittent fasting. And then very little of them succeeded. And I was like, okay, why is this not working? And it was exactly what you said. I was young and naive, to be honest with you. And I just, in my mind, was like, I got really lean and felt great doing this. It must work for everybody, but that's never the case. It's highly individual.
Right.
So cool. There's one thing I really wanted to ask you, which I think will be cool, especially after just giving us the context of your background, is essentially, I know you can't boil this down into a quick thing. So, I mean, feel free to elaborate.
Maybe I can.
It might be hard to answer, but like, what has changed since you've been here? I mean, you were talking about starting your degree in 79, I think you said. So you've had multiple decades in the nutrition space. What have you seen change? Like, is there anything groundbreaking that you've seen? Like, well, my thoughts have really changed around this, or some of the principles that you knew back then have stayed true this whole entire time?
So when I began, we understood carbohydrate metabolism to the point, very similarly, I would say, sort of where physicists understood Newtonian physics, right? We thought, we've got this down. We understand this exactly. We know what it takes to do high-level exercise, high-intensity exercise. You load up on carbs, and you're good to go. We talked a little about protein, we talked a little about fat, then we got really scared of fat because of the Surgeon General's report and the Framingham study and our very early data on fat intake and the risk of cardiovascular disease. And we didn't know a lot of nuance about fat intake. And the population at large that was exercising was really kind of people who were afraid of cardiovascular disease. It wasn't so much, oh man, this fit like a fitness craze. It was, if I run, I can run away from cardiovascular disease. Like we weren't obese yet. That wasn't a problem. Weight management was a problem always for a fraction of the population. So anyway, the idea that high carb was good for you and a very lean diet, meaning very low fat, was good for you. We had people, and I can't say necessarily me and dietitians, but kind of the global sense was carbs. It's all about carbs. And I don't want to talk about overweight, right? We're talking about athletic performance. Mm-hmm. And things were kind of going along and people seemed to be doing okay. And then Barry Sears published the Zone Diet. And I can't tell you exactly when that was. Maybe, or I feel like maybe around 1990, somewhere around then. And these people who were serious about their training and their diet and eating like 80% carb diets, all of a sudden they started to feel way better. And this is more global. I'm not saying this is what I was prescribing, but this is the messaging that was heard. And it was not that far off of kind of how you would interpret what we were saying. And we looked at, why does this diet make such a big difference? He's basically telling people to eat all the food groups just like we do. And what we recognized was that for people who were, quote unquote, very rigorous about following a sports nutrition diet plan, they had kind of eliminated protein. They were eating very low protein levels, all kinds of athletes. And so the Zone Diet was the first acknowledged 40-30-30 plan. And so 40% carb, 30% protein, 30% fat, and people started to feel way better. And today we go, well, duh, of course they started to feel way better because they weren't eating enough protein, they weren't eating enough healthy fats. Barry, unfortunately, drank his own Kool-Aid, and instead of saying this is wonderful for performance and you probably will generally feel better, he started talking about how it impacts the immune system and eicosanoids, which certainly more fat in the diet would do, more healthy fat, that it wouldn't prevent cancer. It wouldn't, he got way off track. And so his book kind of got trashed because of that. But what we recognized in the sports nutrition field was that we had gotten astray in our messaging. And what people were hearing was just eat carbs. And so every time that happens, we go back to the drawing board because we have to review not only what our research has really told us, what evidence we really have for the messages that we're giving out, and what they sound like to the people who are hearing them who don't have the filters that we have when we listen to information. And so that was a pivotal moment, I think, in the research and practice world. And so we went back to the drawing board. We started to look at protein again and the high value that protein offered and the messaging that says everyone in the US gets plenty of protein. Well, actually, everyone wasn't, especially people who were really paying a lot of attention to a healthy diet. And so that changed. Then of course the obesity epidemic came, and the issues around fat. We learned a lot more nuance around fat. We learned a lot more nuance around carbohydrate, and we started to have some manufacturing with better products that we could actually use. We got scientists working with manufacturers. We got some evidence-based products. We could learn how to focus carbohydrates for performance around performance as pre, during, and post supplementation, and get people not eating so much sugar all day long so they could just get in the carbs easily and not be so full, but really focusing on whole foods. And that kind of brought us up to, yes, we've got this keto thing going on again, and that's all diet fad, impacting the sports nutrition world. But but I think the recognition is every time that there's this huge baseball bat taken to scientific messaging, it forces the scientists to go back and evaluate whether they've got the data that they need. And often we learn more. And so we understand more about fueling than we ever did before, and the role of fats and how fats work. It has made us, the fueling question has forced the issue in the female athletic world. That is a pivotal shift. When fueling started to become such a question, it forced scientists to evaluate female metabolism separate from male. We had to explain better what was happening with elite distance female athletes who were eating a fraction of the fuel that we thought they needed and could still be world-class athletes. Well, that meant that the way we utilize fuel in the body couldn't be the way we had assumed we utilized it all along. And in fact, we had it basically ass backwards. And so in doing that, now we know more about fueling the female athlete and what underfueling means, and low energy availability, a totally new term, versus just figuring out calorie balance. We don't even use that anymore. That's a dated, old terminology, energy balance. And so those have been, I think, I kind of see history in those big chunks. But where we are today, unfortunately, is, and I know you'll get to this, all of this research into the deep understanding of the details of nutrition, metabolism, and sports performance has led us to a reductionist view of food, where all we see food as is a source of macronutrients. And so the concept of getting your macros and being able to throw out whole food groups out of hand, because you can get your carbs somewhere else, or you can get your protein somewhere else, and not seeing food for the holistic contribution that it makes to the diet and to your body is an unhealthy place to be. So that's kind of brings us up to the very present and my current view and the things that I talk about today.
Yeah, I think I would 100% agree. I think that when IIFYM, if it fits your macros, kind of hit the scene, it was the need for micronutrient dense foods just kind of went out the window, and everybody was just focused on macros. And yes, calorie intake can change your body composition, but is that all you're after? And is that sustainable, right? Is that healthy? And I think that's where we really try to push the message of, like, let's track the numbers so we can actually get you in the right direction, but let's make sure we're actually focusing on health and hormones and everything like that as well. I am curious, you mentioned male versus female metabolisms. What research have you come across that like shows a difference, and what is that difference? I know we get a lot of women coaches and clients listening to the podcast who kind of fall into that category where they're under fueling, and sometimes I see they are getting great results at first, but eventually they burn out, right? And I think that adaptation takes place, and it's too little too late kind of thing. But I'm curious of what you found with that and what that difference actually is.
So we have well over a decade of research on female energy needs. It's starting, of course, with looking at the female athlete triad and the results of dramatic underfueling, and the question of, could you head it off at the pass? What could you predict in looking at energy consumption, and what biomarkers could you look at, clinical markers that might give you an indication that things were about to break down? And so research was done looking at what are the actual energy demands on the female body. So just to start with, there's sort of functional differences, and then there's what research do we have. So the functional differences are, we know that at low to moderate intensities of exercise, women or females, adult females, not so much girls, so women in their reproductive years, are better fat burners than men. In meaning that sort of that endurance pace that is at a moderate, that is under about 72% VO2 max, which is when we start to see more high intensity energy demand. And under that, women will access the triglyceride droplets around their muscle cells, which is where they're stored around the muscle fibers, more readily than a male will. It's not the fat on your belly. It's the fat, actually, intramuscular lipids, right? And so women store those more readily. We recover them more quickly, and we utilize them in a more sustained fashion in this sort of moderate to moderately high intensity exercise. So it makes us really good endurance athletes. We can access those fats better, and we store them faster. We recover them faster. Men will use more carb. So men, their carb burn rate will be higher typically. And of course, there's always going to be a bell curve, right? I mean, every person isn't the same. And I have had clients that I've done studies on, females who burn carbs like a man does, right? I mean, so we've got, like a more typical male will. And so we've got a range, but in general, the carb burn rate of a woman at moderately high intensity exercise, so she's out running that endurance exercise, right? She's burning more fat than carb for her fuel. At high intensity levels of exercise, men and women burn fuel identical. So once you're at high intensity, HIIT training, anything like that, male and female physiology is the same. Then there's the data on sort of energy burn selection. So what we used to think was that in people who did high levels of exercise, we would determine their foundational energy needs first, sort of their, look at their basal metabolic rate or their resting metabolic rate, determine their needs for health, their energy needs for health, separate from their training exercise, that energy that you consumed would be secured by the body to support those health needs. And then everything that was left over would be utilized for your high exercise burn. So you couldn't sustain high intensity exercise for a long period of time if you were under fueling. You would run out of gas. And so that was the conundrum with these female athletes. They ate very little, yet they could be world-class athletes. That just didn't ring true to the paradigm that we had come up with until we actually did the measures. And the body will fuel the high energy demand first. And everything that's left over goes to the sort of what we say non-essential foundational health needs, which is why underfueling causes you to lose your reproductive cycle right away. Mm-hmm. Bone mineral health goes down the tubes, immune function wanes, brain fog, inability to sleep and rest, nervous system gets all upside down. Your hair, your skin, all of that starts to look bad, and particularly you're not going to gain muscle, right? I mean, your training goes down the tubes. Yet, what happens when you begin a protocol like that? Well, if you're in any kind of sport that depends on a power to weight ratio, you've still got your power. You don't melt away immediately. So your body is used to pushing against a certain weight. You now have dropped probably around, usually average will be about 10 pounds, right? People will drop 8 to 10 pounds. And now their performance is amazing because with the same power that they always had, Now remember, they're fueling their high intensity exercise primarily. They still have all that energy to fuel that training, and they're pushing around 8 to 10 pounds less weight. So their first competitive season like that is unbelievable. They ramp up. You know, road cyclists are famous for reporting amazing leaps in performance. Certainly any kind of endurance or any kind of, you know, wrestlers, when that power to weight ratio raises the power so distinctly over the weight, you get amazing initial performance, and that can last for a whole season. And then it's the next season that it doesn't work quite as well, and you go, oh, maybe I'm not restricting enough. And so now you restrict even more, because the last time you restricted, you got this amazing performance. So now you restrict more. Now you start to get some deficits, things that start to not go right. And what really happens with underfueling and undercarbing in particular also is your rate of perceived exertion goes up. So you feel, if you're not doing anything that, so this is more general population, if you're not measuring something, your output, your watt output, your lifts, something that gives you a measure of actual performance or performance, what your gains are over time, your rate of perceived exertion tells you you are working out as hard as you always have been. But your watt output, your energy output does go down. So when you may think I'm on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being, you know, puke or pass out, 1 being sitting on the couch, when you would perceive you're at a 9 or a 10, but you're actually a watt output of a 5 or a 6. And so you plateau. You're not going anywhere. And then over time, the more you restrict, the worse it gets. People coming into my office, I'm training harder, I'm training longer, I'm getting softer, I have brain fog, I'm not sleeping, I'm restricting more, my diet is perfect. And I always say, and here you are, like, why are you here if your diet's perfect? So these indicators, so what have we learned about the female athlete? And I know you said you probably can't say this in a nutshell. And so, well, I did a little bit at the beginning. So the thing about the female athlete is we have now got clinical measurements. We know that when you look at calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, not lean body mass, which is different, calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, that if you are consuming less than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, a female athlete, or an active female, you have to be pretty active, will show deficits in reproductive hormone production. We can measure it. We know it is the beginning of the slide into the female athlete triad. So we can start to predict that reproductive function is going to start to wane. So losing your period is not something to celebrate. It's a sign that a host of things are starting to break in your body. And so we can measure this. You know, of course, we have to know dietary intake. We have to know fat-free mass. And so once you have that, and I can tell you most female athletes come in needing an extra 1,000 calories a day just to get to 30 to 35 calories per kilogram fat-free mass per day. So ultimately, we'd love them to be at 45. Now, these numbers are specific to a decade of research on female subjects. The International Olympic Committee has taken this concept and said, we know that this applies to men, that theoretically this is going on in men too who restrict. I certainly had a hypothyroid male bodybuilder more than once in my office from severe carbohydrate restriction. We've seen divers, we've seen all kinds of male athletes who do restrict like this, who probably have similar kinds of metabolic changes and physiologic outcomes, but we don't have the data that's on women is particular to women. And so Red S is something that a lot of people probably read about. We've got pictures and diagrams and everything of how it impacts hormones and all kinds of performance outcomes. But the numbers that we actually use clinically don't transfer as far as we know. We don't have data to say yes or no.
I think that's really helpful because there's so many people, even that we take in as clients, that are under eating before we start, and usually they are women. It was also cool to hear what you were mentioning about triglycerides and the fat, and I think that it's funny because I get the question, not too often, but I'll get the question of like, what's the minimum amount of fat an athlete or somebody trying to change their body composition needs to intake? And I always say it depends. It's very individual, but I tend to lean on a higher number for women in most cases. And in my experience, women can't go nearly as low as men can and still feel okay. But then as you kept going, I started thinking too, is part of this might be, I know we don't have the research on men, but part of this might be we don't have as much signals to let us know that something's going wrong, right? You guys have a really big one. When you lose the menstrual cycle, obviously something is not going right. And even to add to that, like men don't typically pay attention to if their nails get brittle or crack, if their skin's drier, or if their hair is starting to, get drier, have split ends. Right. We don't care about that. But those are also signs if something metabolically is going wrong. So I think really good points. I love what you went to, and I'm glad you didn't just give me a quick short answer on that, because I think that was super practical and applicable to the audience, because I want to use my time with you as valuably as possible. I do want to get into wheat, because you have a stance on wheat, and I've really enjoyed seeing that and knowing that you're going out and talking about that, because I think we went through a period of time. I mean, I even remember buying the book just to read it, just because I'm one of those people that if there's a fad or if there's something going on, I'm going to look into it and read about it.
Sure.
And I want to say it was called Wheat Brain or something like that. And
Grain Brain.
That's what it was.
Or there's Wheat Belly.
And Wheat Belly. I actually have Wheat Belly as well. But essentially, it's a lot of these things saying that like grains are bad for us. And if I'm not mistaken, you're kind of taking a stand against that, correct?
Yeah. So what I say is it's not the grain's fault, right? It's what we have done to it. And so I just want to step back just a tiny bit and say, in men, very low fat diet will affect testosterone production. And so certainly you will see decrements in performance, in libido, in if you're trying for gains, you'll get that. So on both sides, men and women, it is often misinterpreted initially as overtraining syndrome. I call it underfueling syndrome. However, ultimately you will go into overtraining syndrome. But check. If you're starting to see plateaus, you think that things are just not right, get to somebody who is a specialist in sports nutrition, who isn't just following the latest fad, because restricted dieting is a big deal. And sometimes we use it as a tool in our toolbox, right? The whole concept of periodized nutrition is something, if you go back to the original 1997 Power Eating, that's where it is. That's where it starts. And I was working with the man who started periodized training in strength training. And so if we use lots of tricks throughout a season, but restricting isn't something you want to do all the time. So
yeah, it's a cyclical thing. That's what I always say.
Yeah. So wheat. So here's the thing. Think of grains as a fresh food, just like we think of our vegetables, just like we think of, you want to see the face of the cow that you're eating the steak from, just like we want to make sure that our butter is as fresh as it can be, or our milk is as fresh. Think of all fresh ingredients. Think of grains in that category too. Yet, most people don't access fresh grains, fresh, harvested, local, wholesome grains. What's happened to our food supply is that in general in the US, we think of grains only as an ultra-processed food. Breads and cereal and pasta, those are pretty ultra processed foods if you're buying commercially, prepared products. And so, I'm going to work from the farmer forward. So our farmers are growing monoculture wheat. That wheat was ultimately bred for transportation and yield. And that it's all a consistent, homogeneous color and easy on the machinery to make flour. It has nothing to do with nutritional value or taste, just to start with. So we've bred that all-purpose flour has no purpose at all, right? I mean, so just to start with. The second thing is that those folks who are trying very hard and are buying 100% whole wheat something, anything, whether from flour to a baked product, unless that flour is stone ground, that flour, now hold on to your seats, everybody. It is made into 100% all white flour, and then the fiber is added back. So steel roller mills don't stop and then bring in whole wheat flour. They are making all the flour white, and then the US government says you can call this 100% whole wheat flour as long as you add back at least 50% of the bran that you took out, and they're supposed to add back other components from the germ, which would have healthy fats and other nutrients. But I have not for decades had a bag of commercially made whole wheat flour go rancid on my shelf. When I was a kid, it did. And that's because it still had fat in it. But it doesn't have any fat in it. It's like the tuna fish in the can that has only 1 gram of fat per serving. If you're eating tuna, it's got 7 grams of fat per serving. They're taking the healthy fish oils out and either dumping it overboard or putting it in a fish oil supplement. You have to buy boutique canned tuna to get healthy tuna. So go to tunatuna.com, my friends who have the most wonderful tuna. But anyway, and they're from here in Seattle.
Oh, I love it.
So that's what they're doing. So you've got white flour where they're thrown back in a pittance of what was originally in the flour, and they're allowed to call that 100% whole wheat flour. So just let that sink in for a minute and know that even when you think you're doing everything you possibly can to get all this wholesome, good bread, it's not. Then, in order to commercially make bread, that the time that it takes to make bread has to be pretty fast in a commercial establishment making our loaves of double plastic wrapped bread in the grocery store. They put in tons of extra yeast that's not in a naturally raised loaf. They add tons of enzymes. They add all kinds of things in there, and they add extra gluten, by the way, just to get it to make that loaf in a couple of hours from start to finish. And so it is not a surprise that those loaves are making people uncomfortable in their gut, because a loaf that I make at home and that we're talking about, that you don't have to make at home, but you can find in almost every city in the country, is a loaf made from stone ground flour. In fact, from here in Seattle, we can go to the mill up in northern Washington. We can get our own flour. You can order it online. Amazon sells some of these flours. There's websites to go to find stone ground, wholesome flour that will be mostly whole grain. Even if you get white flour from them, it still is more wholesome than, and it's fresh, because we want fresh ingredients, because when they're old and they're months and months old on the shelf, things have been added to keep them that way, but they don't have to put it on the label. So fresh flour that uses a sourdough technique or a long, slow fermented rise. Everyone's heard about cultured foods and fermenting and how good that is, that process is for your gut. It's the same in bread. Bread would never have been called the staff of life if it hadn't been really good for you. And so folks who are experiencing discomfort and say it's from the gluten, it may not be from the gluten, or it may be, but it may be from the process that that grain is put through from start to finish. And so if you can access fresh flour or an artisanal bakery, ask them. All their loaves won't be made this way typically because it's just too expensive, but they will have one or two or a handful of loaves made using the slow fermentation process, sourdough technique we call it. That doesn't mean San Francisco sourdough bread. It's actually the technique of using wild yeast and a starter to slowly ferment and rise your bread over, you know, either an 8-hour period over the day or a 12-hour period overnight. So it's the wholesome ingredients, and then you don't have to eat bread or pasta if you don't want to. Eat the whole grain, and here's why. Because in study after study after study, and in the most recent study looking at disease around the world, and then 29 different countries, in the United States, the #1 dietary reason for chronic disease is lack of whole grains. Not too much sugar, which is there, not too much salt, which is certainly, you know, #2 and #3, but #1 is lack of whole grains, because the whole grain actually brings in a unique fibers that we call prebiotics. They feed the probiotics, they feed the cultures, the important yeasts and bacteria of our gut biome, the biota, the living things in our gut. They need food too. And the fiber from whole grains is unique to feeding these cultures, and these fibers also help those cultures create a mucosal lining around your gut to decrease inflammatory processes. And then when we eat breads that are slowly fermented to rise, that process itself, it diminishes some anti-nutrients that are in wheat that you read about and say it's so bad because you're not going to absorb all the iron and the minerals from grains because there's all these anti-nutrients in wheat. Well, when you ferment them, that goes away, and many enzymes are developed that are highly anti-inflammatory. And so whole grains are potent anti-inflammatories. They decrease inflammation in the gut and thus in the whole body. And so to understand that by eliminating whole grains out of hand, you are eliminating some of the most potent anti-inflammatory foods. We don't need to be looking for, you know, very special berries. Eat whole grains, and you can eat the whole grain. You can buy spelt, you can buy wheat berries, you can buy, you know, you can eat gluten-free whole grains if you want. You know, of course, quinoa, amaranth is actually a seed. Quinoa is actually a seed, but they're in the whole grain category. Find gluten-free whole grains if you need that. I am right now in the midst of raising 90% spelt bread upstairs in my kitchen. And that is a low gluten bread that is really bread. And it's very nutty and very tasty, and it is an absolute whole grain. And by mistake, instead of spelt flour, I got whole spelt, and I have cooked that. That's delicious. You cook all this stuff just like brown rice, which, by the way, is a whole grain. It's that easy. So there's brown and red and purple and black rice. There's farro, einkorn. Those are the ancient grains. They're all available easily online, or as I said, in many sort of more natural health food stores, you can find a smattering of these.
I love that, because I think this just kind of doubles down on the idea of it's more than just calories, right? It's more than just macros. Like, you really do have to pay attention to what that intake is filled up with. And I know a lot of people, when like the whole gluten-free craze came around, and, I lost 30 pounds of gluten-free diet. What else did you cut out?
Right,
Because,
donuts.
yeah, exactly. It's usually a correlation with the type of, or like what's along with it, all the trans fat and the fast food and things like that. So that's super practical. Do you have like for people who are like, okay, cool, I can eat bread now, like, thank God, and they're going to go to the store, do you just tell them to look for local whole grain? Like, and if you do that, you're probably safe.
So a bread made with stone ground flour will say so in the ingredients. Like, they're going to make a big deal out of it. If you go to, like I said, your local, if you have an artisanal bakery, ask them, what flour do you use? What % of this bread is whole grain? Where do you get your flour from? Do you use a slow fermented rise or a sourdough technique? Many bakeries will add a very small amount of yeast, a gram or 2 grams. It speeds up the process very slightly. It makes a little more commercially successful product, a little higher rise, a little prettier. And so that's fine. There's nothing negative in that. They're still doing a slow fermented rise. Great Harvest Bakery is a national chain, franchise, and they grind their own wheat there. So that's a good one to look up and follow. I would say, go online locally and look. The stuff that's produced that looks pretty, that's your sort of, your local grocery store bakery bread that looks very white on the inside, is unlikely to do this. They're still making a commercial bread, probably a pretty commercial process. There are ways to make it look like an artisanal bread, but it isn't a slow process. It's slower than, Wonder Bread, but it's not as slow as kind of what I'm talking about. And so look it up. I actually can send you, I have to be honest, I am so bad with social media and my website, but I will put I need to put some resources up on my social media, which is @PowerEat is my Instagram, and Dr. Susan Kleiner is my Facebook page. And I've done it before, I'll put it up again, and I can send you some to put, we can share that so your listeners can hear. It's just really important. I mean, there are nutrients in grains, where grains are the most abundant resource. Your B vitamins. Everyone's always looking, do I need to supplement? How much do I need to take? Oh my God, I don't get B vitamins. Eat whole grains. I'm not an anti-supplement person. I definitely use supplements, but I would like people to get as much as they can from food, because those are going to be most well and efficiently used by the body.
Especially when it comes to things like vitamins and minerals like that, right? Versus, I know you're a fan of intra-workout carbohydrates, obviously, because of your product, Vitargo. But I think, creatine, intra-workout carbs, things like that, I get. But I agree, you should try to cover your bases with food first. I think that's always a safe bet.
Absolutely. And as I said, there are times when we're using all our tools in our toolkit. And so I did a talk, it was kind of like a TEDx talk, the Hilliard discussion down at Texas A&M University a couple of years ago, and talked about, it's well known that I've worked with Sue Bird for a number of years, and during the Storm's championship run in 2018, she also needed to get ripped for the ESPN body shoot at the same time. And those are mutually exclusive diets.
Yeah.
So how did we do that? And I talk about it in that video, and it is posted on social media. And so or go to the Hilliard discussion. but it is saying, well, let's utilize our knowledge about when we remove some carbs from the diet and what effect that does. We acknowledge this is when science is pushed, we need to rectify misinformation coming from our own, mouths. And so that was what happened as the low carb diet craze kind of crept up on us. So we can utilize that and understand how to use it best, and then put the carbs. With Vitargo, it's putting the starch around your training so that you can fully fuel your training and feel empty enough to train. You're burning it, your burn rate during training and what it takes to recover for your next bout, and it's not going into storage on your body, it's going into storage in your muscles. And they have all that data. It's a proven product. And so we could use that and then cut out some of the starchy foods the rest of the day. And that was pretty amazing, because when we think about energy balance, when you do talk about balance throughout the day, peaks and valleys in your deficits and getting, ramped up to go into exercise, energy balance, your body responds moment to moment all day long. It's not a one-time deal. Like, it doesn't check in at the end of the day and see where you are. And so you can put that to work for you. And I say, put your carbs to work for you. And that's how we sculpt the body.
I love it. Yeah, that's so important. I think it's one of those things where I've found with Vitargo and a couple other products, I use them even my bodybuilding show to try to keep some strength, because it was like,
oh yeah,
I have to cut carbs at some point just because I'm reducing calories. I'm trying to get leaner.
Right.
But being able to keep that in during and right after the workout actually helped me maintain more muscle, maintain more performance while doing that. And I've used that as a tactic many times. So I love that you brought that up and that you can actually talk about the science with it, which brings me to my last question for you, is just kind of, I'm going to link it in the show notes so people can grab it if they're interested, but your new, the 5th edition, you said, of Power Eating, what's inside? Like, if you can just break down maybe the table contents, or kind of let people know what they're in for if they grab a copy.
This is funny. Here it is. With
Perfect.
all my little notes in it too, my little tabs. So that's the book.
For the tabs that for your 6th edition?
Yep. So what's cool in this one, first of all, is the cover. I have argued with Human Kinetics for the last 2 editions to put a woman on the cover, and this time I said I wouldn't write it if we didn't have a woman on the cover. And so I'm thrilled that we have a female on the cover along with a male, and I know they're doing a proper lift, which was very important to me. The form was good. So in this book, so it is focused on strength and power. However, because today it's not just athletes that are in strength and power sports, but it's all athletes who strength train. Mm-hmm. The information is there to support your sport, as well as if your sport is a strength or power sport. So it's the science behind what we understand it for both mental and physical performance. It's behavioral strategies. It's also diet plans. And so the periodized diet plan, starting with, are you just trying to maintain? Are you on an off season, or are you in your season and you're trying to maintain? So many athletes drop weight in season in team sports. So there's a maintenance plan, a building plan, a cross-training plan, and that's the plan mostly for athletes who are in competitive sports, team sports, or whatever they do, whatever kind of whatever sport they do, that lifting is part of their training protocol, but their actual strength is not part of their sport. Swimmers, or cyclists, or anybody, or soccer players. It can go all the way across the board. Then certainly a losing fat and a more cutting plan. So the cutting plan being really the 2-week plan, getting ready to go on stage, or I used to laugh in the old days and say, or trying to get into that bikini or red dress to go on your cruise, but nobody's going on cruises now. So it's, to walk around in your house.
Yeah.
So the cutting phase is very brief. That is under fueling, and a well-trained, well-fed athlete can do that for 2 weeks and be fine. Not lose power, strength, data are real clear, but then you need to stop. And so that's the 2-week plan there. And I've got, as I said, several chapters on the brain, several chapters for the female athlete, and then woven through the whole book really is macros, micros, a lot on plant foods and botanicals for the brain, all of that, because sort of the neurobiology of food and its impact on the brain has been a part of my work for 2 decades. And starting around 1999, I started working on food and mood and the way food impacts mental energy, mental focus, cognitive performance, rest, relaxation, recovery, all of that. And I even wrote a book called The Good Mood Diet. And that was really, my clients were saying, will you write a book for my mom or my husband or my partner or my sister or somebody who's not an athlete, but needs to learn what you're teaching me? And so this was more about how you feel than about physical performance. And so my athletes have always called it power eating light because the principles are the same. It's just a different story.
Yeah. I love it. That's perfect. I think for all the people listening, we'll put some links in the show notes so they can grab it. I highly recommend it, obviously, because I have read previous ones, and I'm going to grab this one to read that as well. For those listening, so I can link them and they can click on it, can you drop us like Instagram, website one more time, stuff like that, so they can check out your content and access the book?
Sure. So website is drskleiner.com, drskleiner.com. At Power Eat, Instagram and Twitter, and Dr. Susan Kleiner, Dr. Susan Kleiner on Facebook.
Perfect. I'll link all those in the show notes. Once again, guys, I highly recommend you check those out. She's been in the game for a long time, and she's been somebody that's educated me since I literally started this career. So it's really, really cool to have you on the podcast. Thank you for your time, and thank you for dropping knowledge with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. This is a ball. I love doing this.